Hello, this is Nicole Spohr for Spellbinders. Today I'm sharing a card featuring inlay sketched blooms. Inlay die cutting is one of my favorite things, and these flowers just come to life with the beautiful inlay. I'm using the following dies to create my card today: the Die Delights Sketched Blooms and the Die Delights Sketched Blooms 2. These worked so well together. To start, I want to create a background that's really going to make my flowers the star of the show. So for today, I've got a piece of Bristol Smooth cardstock here. I'm using Bristol Smooth cardstock because I want to do some ink blending and get a really beautiful seamless blended result. So I am going to stamp a text background stamp on this Bristol Smooth cardstock. I prepped the paper first with a powder tool to help the embossing powder stick only to the text that I stamp here with Versamark ink and hopefully not migrate anywhere else. I'm going to press that in place really good on this cardstock, sprinkle on white embossing powder. I want to make sure and completely cover this. Kind of something that I do a lot is if I'm not sure what I want for a background, a text background is almost always a good bet. And an embossed or an embossed resist background like I'm creating here is subtle enough that it won't overpower the sketched blooms. Like I mentioned earlier, we want those to be the star of the show. We want this beautiful flower garden across the bottom of the card. And so a text background, an embossed resist text background, is only going to enhance their beauty and not take away from it. So I'm going to go ahead and heat emboss this. Because it's a big area, it does take a little bit. You want to make sure and keep moving that heat embossing tool so that you don't get any scorch marks or anything like that, and that you get a nice, even, melted embossing powder background. Then I'm going to use a Easy Clean craft mat to protect my work surface because I'm going to be doing some inking. Now the Bristol Smooth cardstock is going to work great for regular distress inks or distress oxides like I'm using today. Pick your favorite color palette. I purposely picked colors. I had already die cut a bunch of my flowers off camera, so I kind of knew my color palette, what I was going for, and I purposely picked colors that would complement my die cut flowers. I'm going to start with peacock feathers along the bottom, then I'll have a little cracked pistachio in the middle, and finally finish with twisted citron up at the top. The distress oxides just go on so smooth and so beautiful. One thing to keep in mind about Bristol Smooth cardstock is your fingers. You can leave finger marks in the ink before it's dry. So a lot of times I'll just use a scrap piece of paper. This paper is purposely bigger than A2 sized. I will be trimming this down to 5 1/4 inches by 4 inches before I adhere my flowers. Once I have that seamless transition, I will spritz this with water from a distress sprayer, blot that dry, buff any ink that is sitting on top of the embossed areas off, because otherwise it will never ever dry. And you definitely want that to dry, so you want to buff any of that ink off, and then I will trim down this background and set it aside for just a minute while I gather up all of my die cut pieces from the Die Delights Sketched Blooms and Sketched Blooms 2 dies. I used an assortment of cardstock in an aqua, teal, mint, yellow kind of colorway. Now I went ahead and I've already attached 2 of my flowers. I'm using Ranger Multi-Matte Medium, and I've die cut the outline, or I've die cut the flower several times from different colors of cardstock, but the outline is going to be black. I found I was going to start adding all of the outlines, but they overlap a little bit, and overlapping them gives such a more cohesive look to the flower garden rather than trying to adhere each of them. Plus I can fit a lot more across the bottom of my card. So what I found that worked the best is to go ahead and adhere the outline and fill in the flower. So at this point I decided I needed to make sure I filled in all my flowers before I got too far ahead of myself. So I'm going to just backtrack a little bit and fill in You can see that this flower has yellow and orange, green leaves. The first flower is kind of a nice light aqua. My third flower is going to be teal with a little bit of yellow accents. All of the leaves are the same color for each. And I'm using that Ranger Multi-Matte Medium with a fine tip applicator to inlay the pieces. The pieces are small. I am using the tool-in-one to pop them out of the die if they don't come right on out. And then use a jewel picker or some other tool to help you pick up those little teeny tiny pieces and put them right where you want them to go. I even would overlay the die cut piece. You can see I've got the die cut leaves here. I would layer that over what I've already put down and just pop those pieces out with the tool-in-one to get those in place. The tool-in-one is fantastic for kind of maneuvering those little pieces and getting them pressed down where they go. Because I'm using a liquid adhesive, I also found it really helpful to use something heavy, like an acrylic block, to hold down my pieces once I had them inlaid until they dried. It's going to help them dry nice and flat, not curl up, and it helps with the inlay a lot, especially where anything overlaps. So if some of the petals overlap another flower, the inlay can get, I hesitate to say bulky because it's not really bulky, but where it kind of comes up and over that other flower, it tends to want to curl up a little bit. So an acrylic block or a book or something heavy will help hold that down and hold it nice and flat. And it dries really quickly. Acrylic blocks are handy because most of us are stampers as well, so we have those nearby and they work great. I'm going to just finish filling these in. I did speed up the video a little bit because it is just a lot of inlay. Inlay is one of my favorite things because it is a very easy technique, but it's very eye-catching technique. And lots of ways to do this. I think this would make an incredible set of cards. Maybe you want to make a whole set of thank you cards or something, and you could mix and match. All of these extra pieces can be used to make additional cards. You just kind of flip-flop what color you put where. So keep that in mind as well. Lots and lots of great ways to use all these little pieces. We've got one more flower here. I was just thrilled how well these two die collections work together, and it makes a beautiful flower garden across the bottom edge of this card. So we need to fill in just a few more little areas. This last flower is going to feature more teal plus the addition of aqua. And the flowers are beautiful as is. You probably noticed in the photos of the finished project at the beginning of the video that they have some additional texture with some Nuvo crystal drops. That is another technique that I absolutely love for adding some texture and interest to die cut pieces. I did several projects with this technique kind of before Christmas time or whatever, and it's just become something I really love. I'm going to go ahead and adhere this panel now to a white top side fold card base, pardon me. And since it's slightly smaller than A2 sized, it will have a nice white border all the way around. There is my beautiful flower garden. I did stamp an additional, or a sentiment, I guess I should say. The text background is not really my sentiment. I text a sentiment on a strip of black cardstock. I trimmed it down and adhered that with foam adhesive right above the flowers. I picked something that I thought would work really well with flowers. The "you grow through what you go through," I thought really had a beautiful, it was a beautiful sentiment, and it really worked nicely with the images I'm using. Finally, I'm going to take Nuvo crystal drops and I am going to start dropping them into the flowers and the petals to add texture. And I'm using really small drops for the most part. If you ever mess up like I did here, take a craft knife and just kind of, while it's still wet, and just kind of pick it up. You can get rid of the whole thing if you have to, or you can kind of fix it, whatever works. And that way you haven't ruined your project. It happens almost every time just because little air bubbles get in there. I do try to kind of push a little bit of the ink out onto a scrap piece of paper before I start to eliminate a lot of that. But if I forget, sometimes that will happen. Tone on tone is not going to show up as much as doing a contrasting color like the white drops that I did on the aqua flower, but it adds amazing texture when it's dry. When you run your finger over it, it's just these very little drops, and they've got this fantastic texture to them that I really love. And you can see it a little bit, but it's more kind of a tactile type of thing if you're doing tone on tone. And I'm just going to continue to do this until all of my flowers have some little drops, and the leaves as well. I used 5 different colors today. Simply White is my absolute favorite. The white is phenomenal. It's opaque. It's not translucent, so it's going to show up great. It's going to dry bright white. A couple colors of green, and the reason why, I felt like the apple green is an opaque color and it looked great on the leaves. The key lime is a translucent color. I didn't really have a color that matched the mint cardstock, so I picked this translucent color instead, and that worked great. For the yellow, I used Dandelion yellow, and for any of the dark aqua dots, I used Caribbean Ocean. One thing to note, if you are decorating your Spellbinders die cuts with Nuvo crystal drops, you're going to want to let your project sit for a good 24 hours to make sure that your Nuvo crystal drops are completely dry before you try to put it in an envelope and mail it. Otherwise, they could kind of get squished and flatten, and they won't look as good. So I always try to just set my card aside. I'll come back to it the next day or whatever, and by that time, I am ready to send the card in the mail. Thanks for joining me today for this Inlay Sketched Blooms card featuring the Spellbinders Sketched Blooms and Sketched Blooms 2 dies. If you have any questions about this card, please leave them in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe to the Spellbinders YouTube channel for more instructional videos. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.